Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's Steve with Real Progressives, and I'm very, very disappointed. I know I talk a lot about economics, and I know for some of you that's pretty boring, and I thought that maybe this latest thing that I found would be something that maybe you all could relate to better than some of the more dramatic, broad sweeping economic discussions that I often have. And what it came down to was that I was trying to look at going to our Pennsylvania State Museum, and I went in to just find out information, the hours they were open. I wanted to find out as much as I could because I'd like to take my children there. In Washington, D.C., you can go to the Smithsonian. You don't have to pay anything. You walk in, you can learn all about history. You can learn all about various things. You see great exhibits, see great shows, etc. Sometimes the shows have a dollar figure associated with them, but largely it's free to the public. And so I was trying to figure out what would the state of Pennsylvania Museum, have to offer me. I know it's backwards, but forgive me, it's the way the camera is. So I looked around, and it was a ghost town. There was literally nobody in there. And I went to the curator who was at the front counter, and I said, can I just come in here and experience the museum? Can I bring my kids in sometime? And she was, oh no, we've had budget cuts. And so now it's $7 for adults to come in, and it's $5 for children. And I sat there and I did the math. It was like myself, my wife, my kids. You're talking about a good solid $30 to walk in, just to walk around the museum and see some things that you'd like to see maybe, but maybe you probably really wouldn't pay $30 to go see. And so you think about cultural changes in our society, and you think about art museums, how important art is to the human experience. And you think about how important it is to be able to look at history, and sure, you've got the internet, you can bypass that museum altogether. They probably have more expansive stuff right there on the internet. Anything you want to find, key it in, and as long as you have connection to the internet or your public library, you can find it free. And that's really sad, I mean, it's great that it's free that way, but it's sad that it's not free that way as well. And what it comes down to is that many of our politicians start their political careers at the local and state levels. And when you think about that, what have I always told you guys? You've got to ask the very first question when you're talking about economics, and that is, who is the sovereign? Who is the monetary sovereign here? In Greece, it would be the EU, or the euro would be the coin of trade there. But in the United States, our federal government is the monetary sovereign. The states are highly dependent on taxation. They're highly dependent on transactional funding. So, I've talked about this so many times, and people still come back, and I guess there's 75,000 of you, and probably only 150 of you at any given time, maybe 1,000, maybe 1,500 at most. In some cases it's more, but most of the 75,000 does not see the videos we produce, sadly. So they come back and they're fighting with us about our hard-earned tax dollars shouldn't be paying for studies for Wi-Fi. They shouldn't be paying for this and that. And it's like, our hard-earned tax dollars, they don't pay for that stuff at the federal level. But let's talk about the state. States are run like freaking Republicans run things. They've got to be run that way almost, because if you don't understand that you've got to pay for things through taxation, then you're not going to have them. So the choice is, do you have robust social services at the state level, or do you have nary a state service whatsoever and just hope and pray that the free market takes over everything? And here we are with a state service, the local state museum, and it is desperate for cash. They've put a price tag on a product that nobody really wants to spend 30 bucks on. So I imagine the schools come in and they tell the parents, hey, we're going to go on a field trip to the local museum. It's going to cost your kid this much money for that. It's going to cost your kid this much money for the bus. It's going to cost this much money for lunch, etc. So it's very, very important that when we're talking about monetary sovereignty and taxes don't fund spending and stuff like that, that we understand that when I talk about that, I'm talking specifically about the federal government. The state governments are absolutely strapped and desperate for cash right now. So I have often found that people better understand the things I'm saying when I talk about the benefits of funding the states with federal block grants. Things like this don't happen when you can actually fund that. Priorities of education, priorities of cultural well-roundedness, of exposing people to things, of providing a decent experience as a human being within each state. So it was very depressing to see that, but it really, really reminded me how different each level of government is funded. So as long as the states are constrained to tax dollars instead of the federal government funding the mandates and funding the functions of the states, keep the 10th Amendment alive and well. Let the states administer those federal funds with certain guidelines to make sure that the 14th Amendment is kept intact so people get a quality experience. Okay, so that we don't shortchange anyone. Put some laws in place, etc. There's no excuses for our state treasurers, for our arts, for music teachers in school, for teaching kids music, for teaching them phys ed, making sure they're active. There's no excuses for us to say we don't have the money for that. We have to get our federal government to fund the states because it's just absolutely impossible for the states to fund themselves when you've got places like Texas who will absolutely cut the bottom out of the ability for businesses to come there. They'll literally cut the taxes down to nothing, give them all kinds of sweetheart deals, put the onus on the population. And then the businesses, of course, why not, move to Texas. Or they'll move to this state or they move to that state. And then what do? They leave behind a whole bunch of wreckage with people that are strapped and trapped in places like Detroit. They have no work whatsoever available to them. And all the companies have fled to different states, much less out of the country altogether. So until we understand how important federal financing is to learn, you're going to see more and more states pull the Kansas route, go the Kansas route of cutting every friggin' thing there is to cut. And then what happens? They're going to raise taxes to try and pay for something. Then all of a sudden the wealthy are going to leave the state. Happens every time. It's the white flight, but in this case it's the rich flight. And once the rich leave the state, okay, services dry up, funding dries up, all kinds of stuff dries up, and it literally leaves states destitute and rusting apart and falling apart and corroding. And the people that are there that don't have the means to get out are now stuck in a dead end with no one to bail them out at all. So once you understand the things I'm talking about at the federal level, and once you understand that taxes don't fund spending for the federal government, we can then make policies that help every one of these states. So you're not going into a museum that has nothing in it, folks. Sadly, it has very little in it because they can't afford it, because their budget's been cut and their staff has been cut by 50%, which are jobs for you and me. When that happens, everybody loses. And since these politicians work their way up through the local levels, through the state levels, and then go federal, they're used to being cash-strapped. And rather than asking the federal government to do what's within its purview, they just try and push cuts across the board. That right there is our next great challenge, folks, is to learn federal financing so that we can fund the states, so there are no more unfunded mandates, so there are no more museums shutting down, so there are no more music departments shutting down, so phys ed is a part of our kids' daily routine, so that we're not forcing parents to come up with even more money to fund activities that exclude the poor. It's time for us to embrace the fact that our federal government is monetarily sovereign. I'm dead serious. When you look at this museum that I just came from, it ripped my heart apart. I walked in, I looked around, it was literally a ghost town. They've got this price tag on that nobody wants to pay. Yet they have something that I think that if people could walk in there and experience on their own, they would be more than happy to learn about the history of the state of Pennsylvania and take their kids out on a Saturday morning to go experience it and then grab lunch at a local restaurant, you know, but they can't do that. And that's a shame. Anyway, this is Steve with Real Progressives, hoping that you guys take a few minutes to learn the difference between a monetarily sovereign entity, aka the federal government, and a monetarily non-sovereign entity like your state governments. Thank you very much. This is Steve with Real Progressives. Have a great day.